I mean, if somebody just handed you a book, like a massive book, and told you it was written by 40 different people over 1,500 years, wait, let me use a dash, over 1,500 years.
Right, spread across entirely different continents.
Exactly, across 3 distinct continents in 3 different ancient languages. You'd probably assume it was just a completely disjointed mess, right?
Yeah.
Like a chaotic pile of conflicting ideas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the sheer logistical improbability of it is staggering when you actually lay it out like that.
Yeah.
Because, we are so conditioned to view books as solitary projects, one author sitting at a desk typing out a cohesive narrative from chapter 1 to chapter 20.
Yeah, totally.
But bringing those modern reading habits to this specific text, it actually prevents us from understanding what it physically and historically is.
Which is really the entire mission of our deep dive today. So
Welcome.
for everyone listening right now, we are stepping back from the theology, stepping away from like the intense religious debates to just objectively unpack this structural artifact.
Yeah, looking at the dirt, the ink, the actual history.
Right. Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about a text that quite literally shaped global civilization, the Bible.
Yeah.
And let's just start by shattering the biggest assumption right out of the gate, which actually comes down to the title printed right on the spine.
Yeah, the term Bible itself is a massive clue here. I mean, it isn't some mystical, untouchable word. It literally derives from the ancient Greek word biblia.
Right.
And biblia translates simply to books, plural.
So the mental shift you have to make right now as you're listening is realizing you aren't holding a single novel. You're holding an ancient library bound between 2 covers.
A sprawling, multi-generational library. And to really grasp the scale of it, we have to look at the timeline. So the texts contained in this library were written and compiled over a span of roughly 1,500 years.
Which is wild. Just to put a 1,500-year production cycle into perspective for you, that would be like a single writing project starting during the fall of the Roman Empire, and the final authors submitting their manuscript, like sometime last week.
Right. The contributors are separated by immense gulfs of time. They couldn't consult each other. They didn't share the same worldview and the same political climate or, even the same socioeconomic status.
I mean, among the 40-plus contributors, you've got absolute monarchs, right? Like King David and Solomon.
Yeah, exactly. But then you also have anonymous scribes, wandering prophets. You have a cupbearer to a Persian king.
Wait, a cupbearer? Like the guy testing the king's wine for poison.
Yep, Nehemiah.
Yeah.
And then you've got a tax collector and a first-century tent maker named Paul. Just a massive variety of human experience.
And since they're spread across thousands of miles and thousands of years, I'm assuming they aren't communicating in a unified language.
Right. Not at all. The original manuscripts were penned in 3 distinct languages. So the vast majority of the older texts are in ancient Hebrew, with a few specific sections in Aramaic, which was the common language of the ancient Near East later on.
Okay, Hebrew and Aramaic. And the third?
Then the later texts abruptly shift entirely to Koine Greek, which was the trade language of the Mediterranean world in the 1st century.
And beyond the languages, the source material notes that the literary genres are just all over the map. Like if you wander through this library, you aren't just looking at the same type of document over and over.
No, you're looking at a wild diversity of human expression. There are sections of dry, documented national history, ancient legal codes outlining agricultural property rights.
Riveting stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But then you turn the page and you are plunged into deep philosophical poetry, wrestling with the problem of suffering. There's apocalyptic prophecy, erotic love poetry in the Song of Solomon. Yeah. Wisdom literature and deeply personal letters written by early church leaders to specific communities in places like Rome or Corinth.
It really feels like an ancient anthology series or, I don't know, a massive time capsule. But if it's this incredibly diverse library spanning a millennium and a half, how do you even navigate it? There has to be some structural organization.
Right, which leads us to the physical division of the text, the 2 great historical eras. This is where we look at the macro structure. So the library is partitioned into 2 distinct halves, the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Okay, let's break those down.
Well, the Old Testament is the much larger foundational era, encompassing those first 1,000+ years of material. And the section is shared in part with the Jewish tradition, where it's known as the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Tanakh.
And conceptually, what is actually happening in that older half of the library? What's the focus?
It is wrestling with the ultimate universal questions of human existence. I mean, it opens with the creation story in Genesis, exploring the origins of humanity and the cosmos. From there, it tracks the formation, the triumphs, and the catastrophic failures of the ancient nation of Israel.
Right, tracking that whole history.
Exactly. It lays out the Torah, so the laws and commandments, and documents the writings of the prophets who are just constantly calling corrupt kings back to a standard of justice.
So it's basically setting up this massive philosophical tension and asks, like, where did we come from? Why is humanity so fundamentally broken? Why is there suffering? And it feels like it's just constantly waiting for a resolution to all those problems.
Yeah, that tension is the driving force of the Old Testament. It's a story of a fractured world looking for repair, and that anticipation is what triggers the historical shift into the New Testament.
But the New Testament is radically different in its scope, right?
Mhm.
We go from covering thousands of years of national history to, like, hyper-focusing on a tiny slice of time in the first century Roman Empire.
The lens zooms in dramatically. So the New Testament begins in the first century AD and focuses almost entirely on the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of one figure, Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
It tracks the subsequent explosion of the early Christian movement. You have the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which act as these biographical accounts of Jesus.
Okay, so biographies first.
Yep. Then you have the book of Acts detailing the early church, followed by a whole collection of letters written to these new communities, and finishing with the highly symbolic book of Revelation.
I have to push back here, though, because if you have ancient agricultural laws and poetry in one half, and then a first-century Greek letter about church disputes in the other, how can anyone claim this is a unified narrative?
It sounds completely disjointed.
Yeah, structurally, putting those things together sounds like throwing a medical textbook and a romance novel into a blender.
Well, that is the central paradox of this text, and it's what really fascinates literary scholars. From a purely structural view, yes, it is an anthology of disparate documents. But when you zoom out, an incredibly consistent, overarching narrative structure actually emerges across all those 40 authors.
Really, what does that narrative through line actually look like?
Scholars often break it down into four major narrative beats: creation, moral failure, redemption, and restoration.
Okay, creation, failure, redemption, restoration. Got it.
Right. So the Old Testament handles the setup. A good creation, humanity's separation from the divine through moral failure, often called the fall, and the long, painful centuries of waiting for a fix.
And then the New Testament steps into that waiting period.
Exactly. Christian theology views the New Testament as the ultimate resolution to that tension. Jesus is presented as the mechanism of redemption, leading toward a promised future where the broken world is fully restored. So while you have vastly different genres, those distinct pieces of literature are uniquely arranged to push that single macro story forward.
Okay, seeing that overarching structure makes a lot of sense. But knowing the sheer diversity of the library naturally leads to the logistics of how this all came together.
Oh, the assembly process.
Yeah, because these texts didn't just fall out of the sky completely bound in leather with a neat table of contents, right? Somebody had to decide what made the cut. And I was reading in the sources about oral tradition, which, to be honest, I always assumed was just a giant, unreliable game of telephone.
Yeah, that's a super common assumption. But the modern concept of the telephone game is actually a terrible lens for understanding ancient oral history.
Why is that?
Because we live in a highly literate culture where we outsource our memories to hard drives and written notes. Ancient Near Eastern cultures did not do that. They possessed highly refined mechanisms for communal memory.
How did that actually work on the ground then?
Well, before these accounts were ever committed to parchment, they were stories and histories passed verbally from generation to generation, but they were structured for retention.
Oh, like using rhythm or something.
Exactly. They used specific rhythmic cadences, repetition, and poetic structures, making them much easier to memorize. Furthermore, it was a communal activity. If someone reciting the history got a detail wrong, the elders of the community would immediately correct them. It was a self-regulating, highly respected method of preserving history.
Okay, so it wasn't just one guy misremembering a story at a campfire. So eventually, these rigorously maintained oral traditions transition into the written word. We move into the era of scribes, copying these texts by hand.
Yeah, and I mean, think about the physical labor involved here. You have specialized scribes working by candlelight or daylight, using crude ink on animal skins or papyrus, meticulously copying letter by letter.
Sounds exhausting.
It was an incredibly slow, resource-heavy process. But as the centuries went on, particularly as the first-century Christian church began rapidly expanding across the Mediterranean, a massive amount of written material started circulating.
Right, because everybody was writing letters. There were other gospels, other accounts, other teachings floating around the Roman Empire. So how did they filter the noise?
The process of filtering that noise and deciding which books were truly authoritative is a historical process known as canonization. And we really have to dispel the myth that early church leaders simply got together in a smoky room one weekend and unilaterally voted on a final list.
Like some ancient corporate board meeting.
Right. It wasn't like that at all. It was a messy, gradual, centuries-long process of consensus.
Well, I read that they actually used a very rigorous set of criteria to evaluate these texts. It was almost like an ancient peer review process.
Yeah.
What were the actual benchmarks a text had to pass?
The standards were strict. First, a text required an apostolic connection. So was it written by or closely associated with an original apostle or a recognized prophet? It needed a direct link to the source.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second was theological consistency. Did the message of this new letter align with the core teachings already established in the older accepted text?
Like, it couldn't contradict the baseline data.
Precisely. Third, and perhaps most importantly, was widespread acceptance. Was this text already being universally recognized, read, and valued by early communities across entirely different geographical regions?
But wait, consider the logistics of that. How do you establish widespread acceptance in a world without the internet or telephones?
You rely on the Roman road system and intense correspondence. Bishops and community leaders in North Africa, Syria, and Rome were constantly writing to each other, comparing notes like, hey, our churches have been reading the Gospel of Luke for decades. What are you reading?
Wow.
Yeah, if a text was only popular in one tiny village in Egypt but rejected everywhere else, it didn't make the cut.
It reminds me of the consensus building behind a massive open source project like Wikipedia,
Right.
but drawn out over 300 years via horseback.
That's a great analogy.
And it wasn't just about what they kept, right? It was about what they actively rejected.
Oh, that is a crucial point. There were highly popular texts like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter that were definitively rejected.
Why, if they were popular?
Because when they were held up to the criteria, they failed. They were written much later, often in the 2nd or 3rd centuries, meaning they failed the apostolic connection test. And their theological claims often wildly contradicted the earlier established texts. The early leaders were incredibly protective of the original narrative.
So because of this incredibly human, centuries-long assembly process, it's inevitable that myths have developed about the text in the modern era.
Yeah.
If we were going to look at this objectively, we really need to clear away some of that cultural baggage.
Definitely.
And I think the first massive misconception is that this library is entirely religious, myth-like, just ancient fantasy fiction with no anchor in reality.
Yeah, the assumption that it's completely untethered from history is widely debunked by modern archaeology. Setting theology entirely to the side, the text contains highly verifiable historical references, incredibly precise geographical details, and deeply accurate cultural records.
Can we look at some specific examples of that, like the actual dirt in archaeology?
Sure. Let's take the Old Testament figure of King David. For a long time, skeptical historians assumed David was purely a myth, like an ancient Jewish equivalent to King Arthur, because there was just no outside evidence of his existence.
Right.
Then, in the 1990s, archaeologists in northern Israel uncovered the Tel Dan Stela stone monument erected by an enemy king in the 9th century BC, explicitly boasting about defeating the house of David. Suddenly, this biblical figure is anchored in secular historical stone.
Oh, the Pilate stone, right. I remember reading about that in the source material.
Yes, a perfect example from the New Testament. So Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor who sentences Jesus to death in the Gospels. For centuries, there was zero physical archaeological evidence he actually governed Judea.
So people thought he was made up.
Exactly. Then, in 1961, archaeologists excavating an amphitheater in Caesarea found a limestone block with a Latin inscription dedicating a building by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. The historical footprint of these texts is massive and constantly utilized by secular historians studying the ancient Near East.
So it's heavily anchored in real geography and historical events. But I guess that brings us to the flip side of the coin, the second major misconception. The idea that this text was handed down perfectly intact, completely magically untouched. without a single misplaced comma for 2 millennia.
Knowing the physical reality of how these texts were transmitted, that idea is frankly impossible. When you have human scribes copying thousands of pages by hand by flickering candlelight for century after century, here an error enters the equation.
Now, typos happen.
Minor variations absolutely happen. A scribe might skip a line, misspell a name, or occasionally add a marginal note for clarity that the next scribe accidentally incorporates into the main text.
Which honestly raises a terrifying question for a lot of people. If these are just copies of copies of copies with errors baked in, doesn't that completely ruin the credibility of the library?
Only if you don't understand the sheer volume of evidence we actually have. The reality of these manuscript variations birthed an entire rigorous academic discipline called textual criticism.
And that's not about criticizing the text, right?
Right. It isn't about criticizing it negatively. It's about critical scientific analysis. Textual critics act like ancient detectives. They don't just rely on one medieval manuscript. They cross-reference thousands of ancient papyrus fragments, some dating back to the 2nd century, found in places like Egyptian garbage dumps.
That's wild. But how does that cross-referencing actually solve the variations?
Well, because when you have like 5,800 Greek manuscripts to compare, the errors stick out like a sore thumb.
Oh, I see.
If a 10th century manuscript has a specific phrase, but scholars dig up 20 papyrus fragments from the 2nd century that don't include that phrase, they can confidently deduce the phrase was added later and strip it away to get closer to the original text.
There are some famous examples of this in the modern translations we read today, aren't there? Entire sections that scholars realize were likely added later.
Yes, two of the most famous examples are the ending of the Gospel of Mark and the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John. Modern textual criticism revealed that the earliest, most reliable manuscripts completely lack the long, dramatic ending of Mark. Just cuts off abruptly.
Wow.
Similarly, the famous story in John where Jesus says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." It's a beautiful narrative, but it does not appear in the oldest Greek manuscripts. Because of textual criticism, most modern Bibles actually put a footnote or brackets around these sections, transparently letting the reader know, hey, this probably wasn't in the original.
I find this tension so fascinating for you listening right now. People often want the text to be either 100% magically flawless or totally fabricated fiction. But the reality that it's a deeply human artifact passed down through millennia of dirt and ink, with scholars actively tracking variations to reconstruct the original meaning, I mean, it's infinitely more interesting.
Yeah, it grounds the text in the reality of human history rather than magical thinking.
So, okay, we've unpacked the mechanics. We know it's a multilingual library, rigorously canonized through ancient peer review and continually analyzed by textual detectives. But we have to address the ultimate "so what" question. Why should someone living in the 21st century care about an ancient Mediterranean library?
Because its cultural DNA is entirely unavoidable. I mean, the historical influence of this text is unmatched by any other compilation of literature. It has fundamentally shaped Western law, literature, art, music, education systems, and political philosophy. You simply cannot divorce modern Western thought from these ancient pages.
To take that a step further, give me a concrete example. How does an ancient theological text impact our purely secular modern lives today?
Let's look at the concept of universal human rights. In the ancient world, human life was generally cheap. If you were a peasant in Egypt or Babylon, you were merely a cog in the machine of the state. Only the pharaoh or the king was considered the image of a god.
But everyone else was expendable.
Exactly. But the very first pages of Genesis introduce a radical concept called the imago Dei, the idea that every single human being, regardless of status, is made in the image of the divine.
Which instantly democratizes human value.
Exactly. It asserts that every individual possesses inherent, unshakable dignity. Fast forward a few millennia, and that specific theological concept is the invisible scaffolding behind our modern secular pursuit of justice.
That makes total sense.
The idea that a government cannot arbitrarily abuse a citizen, the virtue of caring for the marginalized, the entire framework of human rights, those ideas didn't emerge in a vacuum. They grew out of the soil of this specific library.
So even if you are a complete skeptic who has never set foot in a church or synagogue, the way you instinctively feel about justice, morality, and human dignity was influenced by the cultural shockwaves of the biblical texts.
Oh, without a doubt. And beyond the societal architecture, it still holds immense philosophical utility. Science is a brilliant tool for answering the how of the universe, how cells divide, how gravity works, but it is fundamentally unequipped to answer the why.
Right, the big existential stuff.
Yeah. The Bible steps into the territory science leaves untouched. What is the meaning of human consciousness? What is the true nature of moral good? How do we reconcile the existence of suffering?
It offers a framework for meaning. Whether you approach it spiritually as a daily moral guide or purely academically as the cornerstone of human history, it remains a text that continues to shape billions of lives. You really cannot consider yourself fully educated on the history of human thought without having some grasp of what this library claims.
The foundational pillars of our civilization are built on it, whether we acknowledge it or not.
Let's take a quick step back and look at the ground we've covered today. We started by shattering the illusion of the single author, revealing a 1,500-year-old multilingual library. We traced the macro story of tension and resolution across the Old and New Testaments.
Right.
We dove into the dirt and ink of textual criticism, unpacked the ancient open-source project of canonization, and finally, look at how the radical concept of the Imago Dei birthed our modern understanding of human rights.
It's a lot of ground. And, as we wrap up, there is a fascinating warning in our source material that I want to leave everyone with. The sources emphasize heavily that this text was not designed for rushed reading. It explicitly states that this specific library rewards reflection, repetition, and comparison.
Which is, let's be real, completely antithetical to how we consume information in the modern world.
Completely. I want you to seriously consider the immense friction between this ancient text and our modern brains. We live in an era defined by the endless scroll. We consume complex geopolitical events in 15-second video clips. We expect instant answers, bullet points, and immediate gratification.
Yeah, our attention spans are basically non-existent.
Exactly. But what happens to us when we collide with a multi-layered, densely packed ancient library that was engineered specifically for slow, lifelong meditation?
It feels like an aggressive culture clash. We want the summary, and the text is demanding decades of our attention.
Are we losing the ability to understand ancient wisdom simply because we have forgotten how to read slowly? If the key to unlocking these profound philosophical depths requires a patient, deliberate pace that we no longer tolerate, well, what other crucial insights are we missing out on?
That is a phenomenal question to chew on. Are our modern brains moving too fast for ancient wisdom to take root? It's absolutely something to think about the next time you find yourself doom scrolling. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring the history around you, keep asking the big, difficult questions, and maybe just for today, try reading something slowly. We'll see you next time.